welcome to Studio One 3.5 Update Explained. My name is Marcus Huskins, and I'm a producer, mixer, engineer from just outside the Toronto, Canada area. And in this course, we're going to be having a look at the new features that have been added in the Studio One version 3.5 update, which was just released recently. So what I wanted to focus on in this video is basically an overview of what I consider to be the main new feature, the flagship new feature of 3.5. And that is specifically the audio enhancements and improvements that have happened with the audio engine, and more specifically in terms of the new low latency monitoring options that we have available. So to start off with over here, let's go ahead and open up our preferences. And if we scroll to our audio setup, the first thing we notice is we now have two tabs, where in 3.4 we had one tab, or I should say 3.3.4, and previous we had one tab. So I've got an audio device tab and I've got a processing tab. Now let's tackle the audio device tab first. First of all, you'll notice that we now have a playback device and a recording device. And this is really handy for if you're doing any work where, for example, you would be using maybe a USB microphone, or you wanted to use a completely separate interface. Maybe it's a smaller Thunderbolt interface or USB interface. And then you wanted to use, for instance, the built-in output monitoring of your laptop. So you could run with a set of headphones or a set of earbuds, but you wanted to have a different playback and recording device. This is something that Logic Pro users have had for a very long time. And I got to admit, even myself, I've taken advantage of this before. But that's the first change we see, is we have these two different devices. So super useful. Now the second change we see, which is not really a change per se, and we'll get into it in a little bit further detail in subsequent videos, but we have a device block size here, but the main difference is that this device block size is now specifically used when you're using the new native low latency monitoring options, and also any monitoring options for that matter, but we now have a separate playback or process block size that's set in the next tab, which is the processing tab. Let's go ahead and we'll select the processing tab over here. The big thing to take away from this tab right off the bat in this video is dropout protection. The processing tab, or setting the process block size or playback buffer, whatever terminology you want to use, it's actually set by the dropout protection level, and it's not set directly the same way that we set a device block size buffer. So what do I mean by that? Well, in the device block size buffer, I can choose these different options in terms of anywhere from 16 to 4096 samples for my device block size. But in the processing tab, we have a dropout protection setting. And depending on the dropout protection setting that you have chosen, for example, medium or high, that will actually set your process block size. I know this might be a little bit confusing, and this is all going to make sense in the next three videos, but I just want to kind of drive home the point over here that we have an audio device block size that we set, which determines the latency that we're hearing when we're record monitoring and arming tracks, whether it's instrument tracks or audio tracks. And then on the processing side, we've got a completely separate buffer that handles all of our playback, whether it's audio tracks, virtual instrument tracks, whether we're going through plugins or we're just using the tracks as raw source tracks. This is being handled, any playback is being handled by the process block size, which is set by the dropout protection level that we choose. So, for instance, at a minimum setting, we have a process block size of 64 samples. And to be completely honest with you, this particular setting would be the closest we can get to the 3.3.4 engine in terms of the behavior. Because as we increase the dropout protection, you'll see that our process block size, or our playback buffer, however you want to define that terminology in your own head, that is being increased. So here we have 512, here we have 1024, and here we have maximum. Now I'm going to leave this set probably to high or medium for the majority of this tutorial series. Now the one last thing that I want to cover over here is a little bit more detail about the buffers. So in essence, I've mentioned the fact that we have a recording buffer, which is set by our audio device block size. And then we've got a process block size, or a playback buffer, which is set depending on the level of dropout protection that we have. Think of the dropout protection as a buffer in between the playback and the record enabled tracks. But there's also one other option that we have over here, which is actually a completely separate path as well. And that is the ability to do low latency monitoring for instrument tracks. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. This is a first. And technically, yeah, it is, because we've never been able to do this type of workflow before. For instance, any monitoring that we're doing on virtual instruments has always been tied to our buffer settings that we have. Whether you're in Pro Tools or Logic or Studio One, it's always depended on, in Studio One terminology, the device block size. But in 3.5, this is completely changed. And you'll see here that we actually have the option to enable low latency monitoring for instrument tracks. Now, how is this possible? Well, essentially, there's three different paths that are happening. There is the playback buffer. Like I said, this is playing back all of your tracks, regardless of whether they're virtual instruments, audio tracks, buses. We then have a low latency monitoring path for instruments, which is over here, enable low latency monitoring for instruments. And then on top of that, we have our audio low latency mode, which is indicated by this green Z over here. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the next video. But you can see over here, these paths are completely separate. Now, this is where the ultimate flexibility and power of 3.5 really comes into play. So let's leave it at that for now, and we'll get into details in the next video of the new native low latency monitoring path and how that compares to standard software monitoring. And in addition to that, we're also going to get into some details about using hardware low latency monitoring on interfaces that support it, such as the Studio 192 by Presonus. And then lastly, we'll tackle the low latency monitoring for instrument tracks. Catch you in the next video.